A thoroughly amateur production, the title card said. Today's video is a simple one. What is bourbon? You may have asked at some point, I know people have asked me, what's the difference between bourbon and whiskey? Well, I want to show you a label, and let me switch back. I'm looking at my notes on the screen, but I want to see what I'm recording so I can at least try to get this where you can see it. This is Knob Creek, and hopefully you can read that. Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey. In other words, bourbon is whiskey. I put that back where it belongs so it's out of my way. I would not want to break the bottle. That would be alcohol abuse. And I joke about that, but drinking too much is what alcohol abuse actually is. So bourbon is a kind of whiskey. There's Scotch whiskey, there's rye whiskey, there's Irish whiskey, there's bourbon whiskey. Because whiskey is just an alcoholic beverage distilled from a mash made of grain. I went into how do you make whiskey in my second video. The last video I did, this is the fourth I'm doing now. So the third video went into what kinds of whiskey there are. Today, because there are so many people who think bourbon and whiskey are totally different, I want to deal with what is bourbon. So it is whiskey. We saw that from the label, and I have never seen a bourbon label that didn't say bourbon whiskey. You'd think people would get the hint from that, but in the United States today, people who can and will read are pretty rare, it seems. It is whiskey, meaning it is an alcoholic beverage distilled from a mash of grain. Now, where it begins to be bourbon whiskey as opposed to some other kind of whiskey comes in with that mash. By U.S. law and regulation, bourbon, or the mash you make bourbon from, must be at least 51% corn. A majority of it must be corn. And most bourbons have a considerably higher percentage of corn than that, 70% or more. Legally, you can make bourbon from a 100% corn mash, and I believe there are some distillers who do that. If I'm not mistaken, and I could be wrong, if I'm not mistaken, Balcones Distilling periodically puts out a blue corn bourbon with a 100% mash, or a 100% corn mash. But it has to be at least 51%. The other 49% can be any grain. The typical bourbon mash is going to be 70, 75, whatever percent corn, a certain percent rye, which provides flavor. They call that a flavor grain. The corn is the dominant grain. The rye, the secondary grain, is a flavor grain. And then some malted barley, well, not necessarily malted, but some barley to provide enzymes which break down the sugars so that the yeast can eat them better. Because it's yeast eating sugar that makes alcohol. There are what they call wheated bourbons, where instead of rye, they use wheat, which provides a less spicy flavor. There are 4-grain bourbons, Balcones Pot Still, or the actual full official name is Balcones Texas Pot Still Bourbon, and it's a straight bourbon. And in the next video, I'm going to go into what straight whiskey is, but that's a U.S. designation, and it means some things. It's a straight bourbon whiskey, and it uses corn, rye, barley, and wheat in the mash. And that, I think, is part of why it's such a distinctively, highly flavored, intensely flavored bourbon. But the point I'm on, I keep going this way and that because I have notes, but I don't have a script. is that the mash must be at least 51% corn, and then whatever other grain or grains you want for the other 49%. The next thing is that to be bourbon, it must come off the still at no more than 160 proof. Now, proof is, in the United States, twice the alcohol by volume. So 160 proof is 80% alcohol. I think in terms of proof. That's what I grew up with. Even though I wasn't a drinker, that's what I learned. Everybody nowadays says ABV, ABV, ABV. To me, it's proof. So 160 proof is the maximum off the still. Then it can go into the barrel at no more than 125 proof, which is 60. Well, I'm not going to do the math, but you take 125, divide by 2, and you get the alcohol by volume. And then in the barrel, the proof usually goes up because in the American climate, water evaporates out of the barrel faster than alcohol does. In Scotland, it's the other way around. The proof usually goes down. In that climate, the alcohol tends to evaporate faster. And why that should be, I don't know, since alcohol evaporates at a lower temperature than water, but that's how it happens to be. And if you ever run across a foolproof whiskey, what that means, at least if it's bourbon, is that it is 125 proof, the maximum proof it can go into the barrel. And then when you bottle bourbon, it must be no less than 80 proof. That's the bottom, and that's for all American whiskey for that matter. These numbers apply, as far as I know, to all American whiskeys. But if it's 79 proof, you can't call it bourbon. If it's 80 proof or above, you can. And there are bourbons that are foolproof, the 125. There are barrel proof bourbons, which is the proof that it came out of the barrel. And that can be 130 proof. 130 some odd proof, because as I said a moment ago, the water in our climate evaporates faster than the alcohol, so the proof goes up as it ages. And it must spend some time in a barrel. In a wooden container is what the law says, but for various reasons, a wooden container is always a barrel. It's easier to move, it's easier to store. You don't have nails and screws to contaminate the whiskey. And it must spend time in a barrel. Now, legally, you can fill the barrel, roll it over 1/2 turn, dump it, and it's bourbon. 10-second bourbon. But I don't know of anybody who does that. You'll get bourbon that's aged at least a year or two. And the barrel that it goes into must be made of oak. It must be a new barrel, never used before, and it must be charred on the inside. Excuse me, I'm just getting over a cold. And there are various levels of charring, and you can toast a barrel, and who knows, maybe one of these days I'll do a video on charring and toasting, although I'm not an expert on that. Remember, I'm calling the channel Whiskey for Beginners, but implied in that is the fact that I'm a beginner too, at least somewhat. 16 months I've been drinking whiskey. So bourbon must be aged in a new oak charred barrel. There's no specification as to how long it has to age. I believe Scotch has to be in the barrel for at least 3 years. In that climate, using the barrels they usually use, 3 years is just getting started on aging for them. In Texas, if you put whiskey in a new charred oak barrel in that climate, 3 years may be just right. And in Kentucky and Tennessee, the heart of bourbon country, 6-8 years is when it's beginning to be good. If I remember right, Maker's Mark, which ages to taste. They don't have a set time. They just keep tasting it. This is what Maker's Mark tastes like, and then they dump the barrel. They tend to age about 6 to 8 years. But there are bourbons that age longer. You might have heard of the Pappy Van Winkle 23-year-old bourbon. That's a very expensive bottle. It's rare because, and I might have to do a video on this, there's the angel share, the evaporation from the barrel, and there's less and less whiskey every year in the barrel. By the time it's 23 years old, you might have lost half the whiskey through evaporation, because these are wooden barrels, remember. And I'll be honest, I'm not sure I would want to try a 23-year-old bourbon. It would probably have so much oak in it. Well, I don't know. I like oak in my bourbon and my whiskey, so maybe not. Maybe it wouldn't be too much oak for me. But I'll never be able to afford Pappy Van Winkle anyway. And there's something else I might do a video on. I'm keeping a list up as I go along and adding to it every once in a while. I might do a video on which whiskey should you buy as a beginner. But anyway, that's what bourbon is. It's whiskey. At least 51% corn, no more than 160 proof coming off the still, no more than 125 proof going into the barrel, no less than 80 proof in the bottle, must be aged in a new charred oak barrel. You have all those things, you have bourbon. It might not be good bourbon. There's good bourbon and there's bad bourbon, but it is bourbon. And so we come to the end of another thoroughly amateur production by a thorough amateur. I hope you don't mind it being really thoroughly amateur, because whiskey for beginners by a beginner.